I've been developing games for a little while now, and as a result, I've become pretty familiar with the Unity game development engine. And every so often, in the midst of developing some of these games, I would sit down and just mess around with the engine. No deadlines, no goals, no point really, except to entertain myself. I wouldn't even really call these prototypes either, because a prototype implies the existence of a finished product. No, these were more along the lines of experiments. Me taking some time out of my day to just go into the Unity engine and experiment with features I haven't tried before. Now, the actual act of goofing off in the engine like this can be pretty fun, but the results are oftentimes a little more lackluster. Most of the time it kind of just looks like a bunch of circles and squares moving around on your screen, but sometimes you'll make something with potential. Such is the case with this. This is by far my favorite of these little experiments that I've made. It's basically a small 2D space simulator inspired by and built with Unity's 2D physics system. I got the idea when I was working with rigid bodies in one of my other games, and thought, what if I just set all of these gravity multipliers to 0? So I opened up a little project, added in a player, and put in a bunch of random objects with gravities of 0, and it was pretty fun. Just messing around with these objects in 0 gravity on its own was really entertaining, and I immediately started thinking of other ideas for objects that could be used in this environment. I made a bunch of destructible objects, like asteroids that can be blown up for minerals, or satellites that can be destroyed into tiny bits. And of course I made bombs to blow them up with as well. I made speed rings and tractor beams that can affect objects in the player. And at this point, when I realized that this 2D zero-gravity experience was definitely going to be space-themed, I went ahead and started taking inspiration from real-life space objects. Comets and asteroids that leave fiery trails through the level, and black holes that will suck everything in. It's just so much fun to see all the different components interacting with each other. Over the months in between developing games, I would just steadily come back to this little experiment and keep adding new stuff. And it just was such a nice pastime to do. But unfortunately, that's the biggest flaw with this thing. It's just a pastime. There were no goals or objectives or anything in this. It's just a sandbox, essentially. So I started thinking, what are some ways I can turn this fun little sandbox experiment into an actually playable game? The first thing that immediately came to mind when I started brainstorming was the game Asteroids. Yes, the very old arcade game from 1979. The similarities are obvious. And I figured it'd be pretty simple to set something like that up in the project. The first thing I did to get this ball rolling was I created a few spawners that would orbit around the player and just spawn asteroids. This on its own was a fun little scenario to play around with, and I could totally see myself making something in the future that does something similar to this, but it's not exactly what I was going for. I used a bit of code to tweak the asteroids so that when they spawn in, they're moving towards the player. This was more in line with what I was aiming for, and all I needed to do now to finish this up was to put the spawners off screen, make them invisible, and then tweak the asteroid trajectory so that they weren't targeting the player directly every single time. And just like that, it's asteroids. To be fair, it's far from perfect, but I was using this more to gauge the fun factor of this type of game than anything else. And after all that, I gotta say, this little experiment is shaping out to be pretty fun. I still need a solid direction to move this project in gameplay-wise, but until then, I think I'm gonna enjoy myself goofing off in this little experiment of mine. If you have any ideas for a direction this project might be able to go in, please leave them down in the comments. I'd be more than happy to see what everyone thinks of this. And on that note, please consider following my development on this project. This is totally something I want to publish and let everyone play, but I'm still super early on into the development process here. So consider subscribing and watching my other videos if you want to see how this turns out.